Hi, Barbara. I'm delighted to talk with you today. You've been a valued author with us, and our nurse learners really enjoy your course on grief, loss, and bereavement. So we'd love to have this Q&A with you to learn a little bit more about yourself and about the course. So why don't we start off by you telling us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you. It is such a privilege to write this course, especially in a time of a pandemic. I am a thanatologist, and I became a thanatologist, a specialist in death, dying, bereavement, sudden loss, because my father, he died by suicide while I was in the hospital awaiting the birth of not one baby, not two babies, but triplets. I was pregnant with triplets when my father ended his life. And I already had a degree in psychology, a Bachelor of Science degree, but I went back to school and I got a master's in thanatology because I wanted to learn about loss, learn about sudden loss, unanticipated loss. And that's what I did. And I studied and I became a thanatologist, but not being able to go to my father's funeral because I was in the hospital, not being able to have the social consolation after death and be with others to mourn. I couldn't attend the wake. That propelled me on a challenge. And I took this challenge, this life challenge of my father's suicide, and it propelled me into my career to help other people who were grieving like myself. But that moved through the years to my not only helping the bereaved, but helping professionals understand bereavement so they could be educated and empowered to provide end-of-life care or work with those who have experienced a sudden complicated loss. My keynotes, my trainings, my webinars, they're also on compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma and building personal resilience in nurses and clinicians who work with those who are facing loss, especially now with COVID-19 loss. So my dad's suicide, it was sudden, it was unexpected, and it certainly was untimely before my triplets were born. I had no mourning customs because I was stuck in a hospital. I lacked social support because everybody else was doing the mourning customs but me. And I realized that what I experienced is very much like what patients and family members and clients are experiencing with COVID-19. There's simply no time to say goodbye. They didn't have an opportunity to say goodbye because of the way the world is with the pandemic. So that's what brought me to writing this course, to being passionate about helping nurses and clinicians.
So why is this course important, and what will nurses want to read about it?
Well, I was inspired by the essential workers, the nurses, and others who are in the trenches because they're facing COVID-19 loss, they're facing grief, they're facing bereavement on the front lines. And nurses and clinicians are not always trained to provide bereavement support. They might have taken one class on death and dying, but they really aren't well versed on especially the new current models of bereavement. So I wrote the course so these professionals are educated, they are empowered when they're helping the bereaved after a COVID death. You know, COVID-19 is a major life stressor with mental health consequences and long-term bereavement consequences. And we're dealing with the distress. We are all dealing with the distress. We are all going through a very difficult time, and that's what inspired me. I wrote this course, COVID-19, Loss, Grief, and Bereavement, so nurses and clinicians have the tools that they need to provide bereavement support while they themselves are experiencing their own losses. We are all in this. We are all facing our own mortality. The fact that we might even bring the COVID-19 infection home. So I'm glad that I had the opportunity to share a little bit about myself and what has inspired me to write this course, because I think it is a much needed course in this time.
Very powerful. What do you hope that learners will take away from this course, Barbara?
Oh, well, one takeaway is to learn the evidence-based contemporary models of grief to help the bereaved manage COVID-19 loss. There are contemporary mourning theories. There are no tasks of grief. And back in the 60s and 70s, that's what nurses and clinicians learned. But now we understand that there are no stages of grief. I'm sorry, no stages, that there are tasks. And the fourth tasks of grief is to accept the reality of the loss, to process the pain of grief, to adjust to the world where the deceased is missing, to find ways to remember the deceased while embarking on this new journey of life where they're missing. I also incorporate the dual process model, 2 ways to cope with daily stressors, like by oscillation, loss-oriented strategies, to confront your grief, to get deep into the grief, and to oscillate away from it, to rest from grief. This dual process model teaches you that you need to oscillate, you need to move away, because if you stay in your grief all the time, you're going to be exhausted. So the 4 tasks of model grief, 4 tasks of mourning model, that's really great to learn. The dual process model is really great to learn, but also another model I incorporated into the course is the continuing bonds model. We do not have to sever the bonds with our loved one. We could maintain an inner representation of them. We could keep the deceased in our memories. There is this spiritual connection rather than a detachment. So when nurses and clinicians learn that there are no stages in grief, and instead that there are tasks of grief, that there is a dual process of mourning, and that we can continue the bonds, I think they will learn so much about their grief. Let me share with you why this is so important and why people really need to read this course, COVID-19, Loss, Grief, and Bereavement. It is critical for us to have practice guidelines in place during a pandemic about death, dying, and bereavement. And these guidelines need to be based on the current research on mental health consequences and bereavement consequences due to a pandemic. We need to know what is causing those individuals to feel anxious, to feel fearful, to feel confused, all the things that we are experiencing. And it is not easy supporting a family that's experiencing guilt and emotional distress. So COVID-19 is bringing about disenfranchised grief in those who are bereaved. A loved one's death by the coronavirus cannot be openly acknowledged. It cannot be publicly mourned. The loss is unrecognized and it's not socially supported. Very similar to what I experienced after my father's suicide. I couldn't attend the funeral. I couldn't sit by the casket. COVID-19 loss, grief, and bereavement. This book, this course is going to help nurses and clinicians identify ways to support those disenfranchised grievers who need them to understand what they're going through. Also, disenfranchised grief, it really complicates the grief process. And I believe that after a year, we will find so many bereaved will be experiencing complicated grief, otherwise known as prolonged grief disorder. The mental health consequences of this pandemic, it's going to complicate grief. So if you read my course, you'll be better able to support those families, those patients, those clients who come to you for support. So you need to be educated and empowered.
This is also important and will really resonate with nurses. Tell us why, Barbara, you decided to create a shorter course devoted specifically to this topic of COVID-19.
I originally wrote the 30-hour continuing education course, over 300 pages. This shorter course is a condensed version of that, but it leans into what is happening now during a pandemic rather than all the other types of losses that are included.
Mm.
I created the short course so nurses and clinicians can learn ways to provide the compassionate, empathetic support that patients and families who are struggling, and they are struggling with COVID-19 related mental distress and loss and grief, and this social distancing and visitor restrictions in healthcare, it's complicating grief. So COVID-19 patients, they're not allowed their visitors, they're not allowed their friends, their family members to sit at their bedside. So families are going to ask, is my loved one comfortable? Do they think I abandoned them at the end of their life? Is my loved one having difficulty breathing? Is the nurse there? Are they dead? Are they alive? This is going to complicate the grief process. The family is experiencing ambiguous loss. There is a physical absence, but a psychological presence. Psychologically, they're still there, but physically, where are they? In an ICU? In an emergency room? I can't see my loved one. There's restricted access. So they have no control over their loved one being alone or dying alone or suffering alone. So the pandemic is also disrupting all these normal death rituals that we need, especially I needed after my dad's suicide. We can't go to these funerals, there's no social support. We need comfort, we're humans, we need a hug when our loved ones are experiencing COVID-19. So the pandemic has disrupted these rituals, and people are having intense grief. And I think that's what's going to complicate their grief process. They're going to feel like a part of themselves has died with their loved one. There's absolute disbelief. There's intense emotional pain. They're going to have difficulty moving on in life, emotional numbness. They might even feel as though their life is meaningless or experience intense loneliness. They're not going to be able to function. These are all criterion for complicated grief. So I created this course for those who want to understand the impact of complicated grief, disenfranchised grief, anticipatory grief, mourning, bereavement, loss, topics that are so hard to understand in the midst of coping with COVID-19.
Thank you for that. Can you tell us what was difficult or interesting about developing this course? What are some things that you learned?
Well, when I was developing this course, COVID-19, Loss, Grief, and Bereavement, I looked at studies, I looked at all the research. And although I looked at research from like 2015 to 2019 on pandemics and disasters, I really focused in on the latest research regarding this pandemic as well as past pandemics. And I found that researchers are focusing on uncertainty distress, which I found very, very interesting, and the impact of non-death related loss as well as complicated grief. So I would say, besides complicated grief, a lot of the research is focused again on the uncertainty distress we're experiencing and all of the non-death related losses that we're going through. So uncertainty distress is when you're uncertain if your loved one will die. You're uncertain if they're alive or they're dead. As a professional nurse or clinician, you're uncertain whether you're going to get infected. You're uncertain when the pandemic will end. This really fuels alarm, and that results in behaviors where you try to reduce the fear of feeling like you are out of control. So there are panic behaviors, and we've seen them in the media. We've seen them when we go food shopping. These irrational behaviors due to the perceived threat of being infected by the virus. So you see it in the media of the shelves cleared out, supermarket shelves don't have food, and what was going on regarding buying toilet paper. All of that was to regain a sense of control due to the uncertainty distress. So also what I found in the research was the impact of non-death related loss. Now, I'm a thanatologist, so my specialty is death dying, bereavement, anticipatory loss, and sudden death. But what I was amazed with, that the new research is coming out with, how we are grieving, we are bereaved, and we are mourning all the non-death related losses. We're losing our jobs, finances, social support, we're isolating ourselves, we're homeschooling our kids. These are all losses that are bringing about fear, anxiety, worry. As honestly, as I developed this course, I realized how we have these fragile illusions about predictability, that we can predict what will happen, or control, or that we can protect our loved ones. In a pandemic, the research shows that is not the case. So we will experience this uncertainty, distress, and we will be impacted by non-death related loss, and we may even ourselves experience complicated grief. Tough.
It's a lot. What observations have you had about people you've interacted with when presenting this topic to nurses or other professionals?
When I present this topic virtually, I'm a keynote speaker, and so usually I'm on an airplane going across the country doing conferences. But now, during the webinars, I'm noticing that in the chat bar, people are sharing that they are experiencing grief themselves. And they're not only experiencing the loss of their patients and the loss of all those non-death related losses and their own family members dying and other professionals dying from COVID, but they're also experiencing compassion fatigue, which is made up of job burnout and secondary traumatic stress. And because they're on the front lines, also vicarious trauma. What I'm finding is that many nurses, especially talking to me in the chat, are saying that they're not prepared for all the dying. They took one class on death and dying, and they're just simply not prepared, and they are exhausted. I'm also noticing a true attempt to make meaning of becoming the family member. They're at a patient's bedside, and they feel as though they're becoming the daughter, they're becoming the son, they're becoming the wife, because that person cannot be present at the bedside. So nurses represent the family who can't be present, and they're making meaning of that. And many nurses, what I'm finding, many nurses and clinicians, they're unaware of bereavement models. Coping with dying, end of life care, anticipatory grief, traumatic loss, complicated grief. They're in the trenches doing the work. They don't have time to keep studying. So they may not be well versed on the newer research and evidence-based models. I'm also noticing protective factors in the chat bar. The nurses and the clinicians are sharing. They're saying, watch TV in moderation, shut off the news, stay socially connected through Zoom, become more spiritual. They're creating little Zen gardens in their backyard. They're creating gratitude jars where every day they come home from the hospital or the long-term care facility, and they're writing a little note to themselves and putting it in a gratitude jar what they're grateful for. And what I'm blown away by is that most, and I've been doing so many webinars in the past 3 months especially, they value their family more than ever. They really don't take that for granted. So that's what I've observed.
Tell us how COVID and the working environment in 2020 has changed things.
Oh, many professionals have very limited training in palliative care. Years ago, I was a hospice bereavement coordinator. I was present for those who were terminally ill, and I stayed with the family for a year after the actual death. And at that point in my life, I realized how few professionals have their own end of life healthcare preferences known. They don't have wishes, they don't have pulse, they don't have advanced directives. And I think that 2020, we need to have our advanced directives in place during a pandemic, working in this environment of death, dying, and bereavement. Professionals are dealing with daily stressors of end-of-life care. So what's changed in today's working environment is the realization that every professional in healthcare must have advanced care planning before they become incapacitated or infected by COVID and cannot share their wishes at end of life. So if you're a nurse or a clinician, get your advanced directives in place. Communicate your values, communicate your beliefs, share your healthcare preferences, because you can become incapacitated. Many nurses, many clinicians have died. So what's changed in the working environment is the realization that PPE, it works, but we are living in a pandemic. So make sure that you have your paperwork up to date and share that information with your family.
Hard to think about, but so important. Barbara, what guidance do you have for nurses and clinicians who are experiencing both personal and professional losses at this time?
It is really, really hard. What I'm seeing in the webinars, in the chat, a lot of tears. People say, you know, I'm writing this through my tears. I'm listening to you as I grab another tissue. That scares me. So I think what we need to do is to look at ways to make meaning of your experience. You might say, I value my family now more than ever, or I understand the significance of helping people, my helping role, or I'm more self-compassionate now. I'm kinder to myself because I realize I need to stay healthy for my patients and for my family, for myself. I think what we need to do is to explore ways to experience personal growth or post-traumatic growth. We can experience positive growth, positive change, greater strength, maybe closer relationships, maybe reevaluate our priorities when we were experiencing our personal losses. This is hitting us professionally and personally. So I think we can focus on meaning making and experiencing growth and creating our own personal rituals of loss and leaning on our faith, leaning on our belief system, knowing that we can continue that spiritual bond with our loved one and that we are not alone, that the world is experiencing loss and grief, and it is painful. But if we understand the grief process, if we have tools in place to help us through it, then we're going to be okay. But during the holidays, especially during Thanksgiving and Christmas and Hanukkah, we are reminded of our losses and we're experiencing the pain. So just realize you are not alone. Reach out to your friends, your family, your faith, your community, and we're really going to get through this together.
Well, this is a hard and complex concept to talk about, but it's very real and very important. So we appreciate all the wonderful contributions that you're making at this time. And thank you for sharing all of these comments with us.
Thank you.